Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. This week we have got an absolute peach for you because it's one of my favourite writers on the issue of the witch hunts in history, really brilliant, engaging speaker who I have long been an admirer of on Twitter. So I'm very delighted and excited to have him on today. But before we go into today's show, Claire, on this, the 59th episode of 6, is there anything you want to talk about?
No, I think we should just skip straight to...
Oh, Claire, come on. Don't be cruel. What is your witch hunt, witch stuff news?
Big news. Well, big news. As you know, Zoe, since we last spoke, there has been an apology from the church in respect of witchcraft trials. So, as I understand it, the theological committee met and considered whether or not to give an apology to those accused of witchcraft between the 16th and 18th century. And on the day the General Assembly considered it, they passed that motion and gave that apology. Zoe, what did you think about it?
Well, I think it's worth stating at this point that obviously the apology sought from the church wasn't one of our campaign.
No.
And I think that was for different reasons. One of the reasons was that I think that we wanted to focus on stuff that had kind of a legal and political angle to it, that we felt that there was a pretty straightforward route to go about it. And the idea of approaching the church for an apology was beset with a slightly more complicated, because there isn't necessarily like a route to doing things in the same way as there's a route to doing things politically or legally. So we were definitely more within, well, your Claire, comfort zone with the legal political side of things. Okay. And also partly for me, I don't want to speak for you, Claire, but the religious side of it, I'm uncomfortable with that anyway, because I don't think that there would have been the issue, obviously, with the witch hunts and the people that were accused and executed if people didn't hold strong religious views. Now, as I would say, I'm an agnostic. I'm happy to be proven wrong on this one if it's a good outcome. But I felt uncomfortable petitioning the church or approaching the church, because I think without religion, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in just now. I don't know what you think about that, Claire.
Wow, that's not like a can of worms. That's like a whole house of worms. You just opened up.
Yeah.
Well,
no harm to the church in this instance. But just for me personally, I wanted to focus on the rational and empirical world of facts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a humanist, so I don't have any religious belief. And my thinking on it was that the church was part of the aspect of everyone's belief at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't separate from the people in that regard. And it, of course, did have a part to play in witchcraft trials, especially in relation to the accusations and giving us an insight into the confessions. So if you had a minister in a particular area that was particularly hell-bent, pardon the pun, on finding witches, then there would be more witchcraft accusations in that particular area. So it definitely had an effect. But for me, these were secular prosecutions. They weren't religious prosecutions. And that's why I preferred to get an apology from the state as opposed to the church. That having been said, I'm really glad that the church have apologised.
Well, absolutely. No, it's great. And there's obviously lots of people still in the world and in Scotland, a fair few amount of people that do have involvement with church, with different churches, but particularly the Church of Scotland, obviously here. So I think that that's really good. And it just shows again what the zeitgeist is really just now, you know, and what people's views are towards the issue of the witch hunts and the issue of modern day apologies for past wrongs and of looking at history. And, you know, I'm really pleased that we've been part of that conversation of pushing that forward and really having it talked about in society, you know, and I think that's something that I think is really a fantastic outcome. You know, it's a really thinking outcome that's come from lots of work from our part and also from community campaigners across Scotland and in fact internationally. So I'm really, really pleased about that. That having been said, I've got some concerns which back up my initial concerns about approaching the church for an apology, which is that there's a really interesting document that the Church of Scotland have written, and this is presumably which is the result of the consultation they did within their members and so on, and their current clergy. And what I want to focus on is this, because this is one area in which whenever we have an article that's in the press, whenever we're approached, whenever the story is covered, there will be some, as we've discussed before, comments under the line, which you should never look under the line, but obviously I can't help myself.
Don't go there, Zoe. Never go under the line.
And it has to be said, it's a very small amount of criticism. It's really not that big of a deal. But one of the criticisms that we sometimes get, or the campaigns sometimes get, is that you can't apportion blame to people of today for what happened to people in the past, which I think is really interesting. And for me, obviously, maybe it's not obvious. For me, you cannot hold people to account because they're dead naturally, right? Okay, I think that part is obvious. But I still think that it's important, an apology societally is something that's important that we look at, and we look at what the function of an apology is. So I think that that's really beneficial.
Yeah.
If you have a look on the Church of Scotland's website, there's this document, you'll find it. The second objection they have, I'm going to read this out, Claire, if you don't mind, and we can have a wee chat about it, because I think it's really interesting. This is lifted directly from their statement or their essay or whatever we're going to be calling it. A second objection is also concerned with blame, but this time with the blame of the group's former members rather than its current ones. The worry is about whether it's appropriate to apply contemporary standards to past actors. For example, many current members of the Church of Scotland will think one of the things that made the witch hunts of yesteryear so horrifying is that most, possibly all, of the accused were innocent of the charges laid against them. This may be because we think the accused could not have made a deal with the devil, or because if they did, the devil is not capable of granting humans the sort of magical powers James VI accused them of deploying against him. It may be because we think many of the accused simply suffered from mental health conditions that were poorly understood at the time. It may be because we think some of the accused were just ahead of their time, having stumbled upon medicinal properties of plants that were not yet widely known. It may be because we think testimony that has been acquired through torture, the threat of torture, or the offer of reprieve is unreliable. It may be because the power dynamics displayed in the witch trials were so manifestly sexist, or it may be because we do not think consorting with fairies is a capital offence. So there's 6 different reasons there that are given. The thing that I really want to draw our attention to and have
you know what it is, Zoe? I think I can guess.
Do you know what it is? It's the very first one there, okay? So one of the things that made the witch hunts of yesteryear so horrifying is that most, possibly all of the accused were innocent of the charges laid against them.
I think I'm going for all. I think
all, right?
That said most or all, I would definitely be ticking all.
That's the point that we are making with our campaign, which is why it would be disingenuous of us to say to the church with the belief system that they still hold, where clearly there is still a belief that you could be a witch, you know, with that clause there, most, possibly all, means that some people believe that there is such a thing as a witch, and that there is such a thing as a witch that's in league with the devil. Now, just absolutely categorically for the record, Claire and I do not believe that you can make a pact with the devil, okay? That's where our whole campaign rests upon. All the people accused of witchcraft were innocent of that accusation. They may well have been guilty of something else. I don't know, murder, theft, adultery, singing drunkenly in the street, but they were not guilty of being witches. And that's what our whole campaign is about, which is why I have a certain level of problematic discomfort with the church giving an apology, which has still got this little bit where it's like, we're sorry, but some of them might have been witches. I find that uncomfortable. I'm happy to have a discussion with a theologian about that on the show. And we did about a year ago, I think, reach out to one of the people that was involved with the apology, and they declined to speak to us on the podcast, probably because of the point that I'm making right now.
Well,
and I don't know, I'd be guessing because we didn't get a reason, but
yeah, in fairness, they did say we can't speak to you at the moment, so maybe we should try giving that a go, because I mean some of the things you spoke about there are fascinating, and
sure,
and I think it would be really, really interesting to see how that concern about there still being witches was overcome in the apology. So I would really like to hear from somebody.
It'd be fascinating, and I certainly wouldn't be interested in sort of saying to somebody from the church, whether it's a minister or whatever, that oh, your ideas are wrong. Like, that's their belief system. I 100% support anybody believing what they want as long as it's not harmful to other people, right? And I think that the Church of Scotland these days is probably not harmful to other people, and it shows with a few things that they decided during their get-together recently, that there are various things that they're moving forward on. And, I think that's really cool, and all power to them, because change is hard for all of us, okay? But I still have some pause about that particular angle.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll give a shout out to anybody who is in the church and will be interested in speaking to us. And maybe we'll get in contact again with Greyfriars. Remember we spoke to them?
Yeah. They were really fascinating. We went and gave a talk at their Festival of Science last year.
Yeah.
And we were also approached right at the beginning of our campaign, so way back in 2020, we were approached by a retired minister who was very interested in the campaign, very interested in taking it forward. But for a couple of reasons that we can't go into just now, we didn't progress with that. But I would be interested to see whether they might actually fancy coming back on and talking about their response to it.
Yeah, I would really love that. Well, that's maybe something for the future. Zoe, is there any other news?
Any other news? Yeah, there are various really cool community things that are happening just now. We've mentioned various groups up till now.
Calder group.
Calder, West Calder, and Peebles. Obviously, Nairn, as you've mentioned there. There are loads of several really great researchers. There's Judith Gorman, who's working away in Forfar, who was recently on the Lucy Worsley show about witchcraft. Maybe we should talk about that a wee bit, Claire.
Oh, it was brilliant to see Judith.
Still available on iPlayer. So if you've not watched it, you can see it on iPlayer. And my understanding is it's available on BBC America too. So hopefully it'll be available around the world. And so people can catch up with it. It was really interesting what Lucy Worsley did. She took kind of an overview of the witch hunts, gave some good history. There were some sort of dramatic reenactment parts, which I'm never really super cool with, but I know why they do that. It makes sense, and it makes it real in people's minds. And I know that talking to people that hadn't really thought about it too much, so a few people have talked to me about that since then, and they really enjoyed that. I think it made it much more real.
It definitely, for one of the first times on British TV, didn't treat the witchcraft trials as a joke, or witchcraft as a joke. And it did what our campaign has been trying to do for 2 years, which is make people think about the actual women and men that went through these accusations. And if we have to do a wee bit of reenactment for that, then I will go with some reenactment.
That's a good word. So we are looking forward to having Judith Gorman back on the show again. She's going to tell us more about what she's been researching more recently. So keep your ears ready, peeled. No, keep your ears open.
Keep eyes. Keep your ears. That's
just pay attention. We'll tell you when we've worked it out with Judith when we're going to get her back on again. So as ever, Judith's fascinating. She's a great speaker, so it'll be really good to have her back on again. And it was lovely to see her on TV, because when the production company approached us about what we might be able to offer them for that was the first person that came into our heads, because Judith's doing some really interesting stuff that's really inspiring, I think, for citizen historians and researchers across, well, I was going to say Scotland, but I guess the world, really. Yeah, because she shows you how to do it, really, and talks about it. So it was really cool, and that was really gratifying to see Judith start to build her TV career.
Yes,
that's the first program, because we now know she's been approached to do something else as well. So that's really cool. Yeah,
fantastic. Well, we'll keep you updated with all info on that as we can. Now, I think what we should do is move to talk about some people who were accused as witches.
Yep. have you got a list of people there, Claire?
Well, usually I name lists of people and I'm able to give you their names. And you know, we've talked about in the past, Zoe, sundry witches, just listings of...
Yeah, that always sticks in my head.
Yeah, it's horrible, where they haven't actually even identified how many people have been accused of witchcraft because they haven't even recorded their names. They haven't even bothered to give us that much information about the history. But this is an absolutely fascinating story. And sadly, we don't have the names or the outcomes of any of the people accused. But the story of who did the accusing is utterly fascinating.
Okay.
I'll tell you how I came about this. I was thinking about those people that were accused and executed as witchcraft in England. And I was thinking, in comparison to Scotland, it was a tiny amount of people. And I thought one of our biggest witchcraft accusation periods was in the period 1661 to 1662. That was one of the big spark points of witchcraft accusations that particular year. So I thought, I wonder how many people were accused in that very year. And I looked up the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, our Bible of information on Witchcraft Act. And between 1661 and 1662, 647 witchcraft accusations took place in that year. Now compare that to the whole of England for the whole period during the 16th to 18th century, where we have 500 people that we know were accused and executed as witches. So it just shows you that disparity. Mm. But one of the first things that I found when I came across that was an entry in respect of a woman called Christian Caldwell, sometimes spelled Cadell. Now, the information that I'm going to give everyone is from the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft. Please do find it. You can find it online just by putting in that phrase. And you can also find it by using the Scottish Witchcraft Interactive Map, which you can...
How's her name spelled? Sorry?
Christian Caldwell, C-A-U-L-D, as in called, W-E-L-L, Caldwell.
Well, that's also known as Cadell.
Yeah, sometimes spelled Cadell, C-A-D-D-E-L-L. So this was a woman called Christian Caldwell, and the reason why I keep saying it's a woman was because her alias, Zoe, was John Dixon.
What is going on here?
I shall tell you more. John Dixon was indicted for dressing as a man and acting as a witch pricker.
Oh.
Yes, so Christian Caldwell dressed up and gave herself an alias, John Dixon, and she pretended to be a burgess from Forfar, and she was going around obtaining jobs as a witch pricker, identifying women. So what was said in the records that are identified in the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft was that she was held in the toll booth of Edinburgh on the 30th August 1662, and she was interrogated by the justice deputies. She said that she'd mentioned 2 unnamed people that she accused of witchcraft and many others from 6 counties. So what the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft did was they estimated the 2 witches from each county, which they brought to a total of 14 unnamed people accused of witchcraft. But you can see how that is a really rough, ready reckoner calculation. It could be more, it could be less, but that is what they're saying. So what happened was, as a man identifying herself as John Dixon, she contracted with officials in Moray to be their witch pricker for a year, Zoe. Not like I'm just going to turn up and go, there's a witch, but for a whole year, she contracted to be their witch pricker. She was paid, and this is a handsome sum, 6 shillings a day, and this is the crucially important part, £6 for every witch who was found guilty.
It's like that bit on the comedy thing that was on recently, the Finder, where Daisy May Cooper's character, the accused witch, says to the witchfinder, so you get paid for each witch that you find. That's not a very good system, is it? You know, that when what would be the purpose of not finding people guilty? Exactly.
So there's nothing like a wee bit of a financial incentive to go around accusing people of witches if you are not only going to get 6 shillings a day, but you would get £6 for every witch that was found guilty. So she travelled and worked with a woman called Isabel Dick, and somewhat unsurprisingly, she claimed that she could tell witches by sight, by looking into their eyes. And apparently she said she'd gained that skill from another charlatan, John Kincaid, a witch pricker active in the Lothians. I should point out that the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft doesn't editorialise, and it's me that's calling him a charlatan. So she was accused of pricking many of His Majesty's lieges in the sheriffdom of Elgin, Forres, Nairn, Inverness, Ross, and Sutherland. So we know that during this time she was going around there, we know it was for a year. She's clearly managed to get away with this deception for a long period of time, Zoe, because she's been around all these different places.
That's nuts. It's just a really bonkers story.
There's definitely a story in there about how they came to find out that she was, in fact, Christian Caldwell and not John Dixon.
I wish we had pictures, photographs from the olden days.
There are no photographs from those times, Zoe, I'm afraid.
I know, it's a wee shame. God, what a crazy story.
Exactly. So what we would like to do today is remember those people who were accused by someone who had decided clearly that they found a way to make money, who dressed up as a man, because presumably, obviously, if she'd said that she was a woman, she wouldn't be allowed to be a witch pricker. So she was dressing by a man and calling herself a different name. And it would be really interesting to know why or how she got away with pretending to be a Burgess from Forfar. I suppose it's just because there weren't records at that time, so it's not like you'd be able to check up your local area and check who they were. So if you just said, I'm John Dixon from somewhere, people would go, okay, fair enough.
I wonder if she had any link at all to Forfar, if that was just sort of, randomly picked in some way, or...
Can't tell. The records, as far as we can see them, or as far as I can see them here, just don't show. But it was clearly somebody to very much be avoided around that time, lest you looked into your eyes and decided that you were a witch. So today we remember the 14 or so people, unnamed people, who were accused of witchcraft by John Dixon, aka Christian Caldwell.
I mean, if I can just say one thing.
Yeah.
Being able to look into somebody's eyes and tell that they're a witch, it sounds a bit witchy, no?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That's quite...
Yeah. Well, what I thought about it was how minimal do you have to be? At least John Kincaid had some contraptions where he put them into people and said, oh, there's this blood and there's that blood, and that's why it's scientific. She was obviously, thinking, I'm not going to do any of that stuff. I can just tell by looking in your eyes.
I mean, you can tell a lot by looking in people's eyes sometimes.
But not that sort.
Not that they're a witch or in league with the devil. I mean...
No. So, on to better stories and better times, Zoe.
Yes. So today's guest, I guess, is where you're leading with there, Claire. Is that correct?
That was a segue, which
I liked it.
It would have been almost flawless had we not now been talking about the fact that it was a segue.
That's okay. Segue,
is that the right word, or is that the things that you go on that's got just the one wheel?
I think it's both things.
Is it?
Yeah, I don't think it's just one wheel. It's not one wheel. It's just a front. If you know what I mean. It's not like a unicycle. That's a different thing.
Well, that's
like
true.
A unicycle. No, I think a Segway is 2 wheels with a standy bit in the middle and then the bit that you hold on to. I'm acting out a Segway for the benefit of the tape. That's quite... Yeah, this has got nothing to do with Segways though. No, but I think it is a Segway. Presumably that the Segway is named after a Segway because it's joining A to B seamlessly.
Joining the front wheel to the back wheel, or joining a person from one place to another?
No, it's the side wheel to side wheel. It's from one place to another.
Okay.
No? Yes.
So, for the love of God, please just introduce our guest.
Okay, our guest today is, very excitingly, Mr. Malcolm Gaskill, and he is the Emeritus Professor of Early Modern History at the University of East Anglia, specialising in the social and cultural history of 17th century England and America, particularly the history of witchcraft. He's written 6 books, including Between Two Worlds, How the English Became Americans, Witchfinders, a 17th century English tragedy, and Hellish Nell, Last of Britain's Witches. And that's a biography of the spiritualist medium Helen Duncan, who, as you'll know, was the last woman imprisoned under the Witchcraft Act in 1944 in England. His most recent book, which we'll be talking about, is The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World. And that's the story of a witch panic in a New England frontier town. I am really excited to welcome to the show today, Malcolm Gaskill. Hi, Malcolm. We're so happy to have you on our podcast. We've been looking to get you for a wee while, and through our fault, through Claire and my fault, there's been a couple of missed opportunities. So I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm actually genuinely quite excited to chat to you. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Thank you very much indeed, Zoe. It's fantastic to finally be here. I thought in the end perhaps you didn't want me, and I was trying to just let me down gently.
Just incompetent.
Anyway, thank you for your determination. I'm here.
Our determination to fight through our own incompetence, Malcolm. That's what you hear.
It's more like thank you for your forbearance, I think probably would be more accurate in this situation. So, Malcolm, we know of you probably primarily through what you tweet, actually. That's how I first came to know of you, and I've followed what you do. But obviously, you're a historian and a writer, and are well known, I think it's fair to say, within the historian circles. Can you give us a kind of like a potted history of how you've come to this point in your career just now, how you started and how this interest developed?
Sure. Well, people have all sorts of weird, wonderful ideas about how I might have, but sometimes people don't like to ask. So I started really when I was a student, and I read Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic. And I just really felt this was a world that I could write something about as a student. And so for my third year dissertation, I grew up in Kent, and I did something on Kent witches and went into the archives for the first time as a student, found I couldn't read any of the writing, was helped by the archivists, and gradually managed to tell a story about the 1640s and 1650s in the county that I'd grown up in, lots of places that were familiar to me. So that gave it a particular kind of excitement, having that local dimension. And then that really grew into a PhD, which was really about all sorts of heinous crimes in the early modern period across the whole of England. And then from then, gradually, out of all my heinous crimes, I just settled on the heinous crime of witchcraft.
It just sort of developed that way. It wasn't necessarily that you had any sort of interest in witches pre-university.
Well, I think I probably did, in the sense of, I was always quite interested in horror films and the occult and slightly morbid things, probably like a lot of kids, maybe a little bit more than most kids. But that really wasn't how I came in. I suppose I really got into it because of the legal side. And of course, all my records were legal records. So I understood witchcraft as a crime in the same way I'd studied all sorts of crimes, and that coming at it from that direction, I really got the understanding of the context of wrongdoing in the early modern period. And therefore, I think there was a danger otherwise of just seeing witchcraft in isolation. Perhaps there still is, but understanding it actually as part of everyday life, which was something Keith Thomas had done in Religion, the Decline of Magic, and also understanding it as a crime which was part of a legal process, and that it was, not just about, say, the kind of stereotype of hysteria, but was actually an administrative and bureaucratic exercise as well, kind of banality of evil type, line of thinking, really, where really, people, and by people I mean men, had to sit in a room usually and make decisions, and therefore witch hunting, again, wasn't just about crowds with flaming torches. It was more like a kind of local government meeting. And that had its own kind of grim fascination, I think.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I'm not a historian, as I'm always at pains to point out, but it's something that I've really found very interesting over the last 2 years, is to discover that it wasn't anything really like the stereotypes that we have. It was just quite a organised and thought through and intelligent way of dealing with a crime. I think that's been really fascinating. When you were growing up in Kent, was there much chat about what happened with witches? Because we've talked about, when we were growing up in Scotland, there was very little chat about what had happened in our local area. So was it known and talked about in Kent?
No, it wasn't really. There was a little bit of folklore that occasionally you used to see, and I don't know, there were, sort of local histories and societies and things. There was a little bit, but there was, of course, things were so much worse in Scotland. The intensity of prosecution was 12 times what it is in England. And it wasn't even particularly bad in Kent. I mean, there were areas of Essex and Lancashire and so on in England where there was some quite intense witch hunts, but there was really nothing like that in Kent. And so I suppose I was dealing with a relatively small sample starting off, but rather than it being a quantitative type study, it was very qualitative. So I was already going quite deeply into the cultural background of these accusations and how they came out of communities. But actually places where there were low, what we might think of as a low intensity of prosecutions, they posed their own very interesting question about why there were any prosecutions at all. If it was so rare, why now and again did they crop up? When I was, again, starting out with my dissertation, I got my dad's AA, roadmap, photocopied it because of pre-internet and so on. And so I had these sort of photocopies and I was just putting red dots on every single time I found a case in Kent. But in the end, it was just a scatter across this rather big county. And it was very difficult to draw any lines of connection between them. Whereas, of course, if you compare that to some of the really intense witch hunts in Scotland, say in the 1629-30, then you can really see how these panics spread, and that beyond a certain point, the more witch trials there are, the more it increases the anxiety that there are lots of witches around, and therefore that something should be done about them. So it's not necessarily quite hysteria, but it's certainly the sense that in order to prosecute witches, you've got to feel relatively certain there are, in their minds, witches around. And that's why I think success in witch hunting terms breeds success.
It was interesting what you said there about when there's not very many cases. Why are there not very many cases? So if there were just a scattering, what was it that tipped the balance and people went, oh, that person is a witch then?
So it's a really good question. And it's still something that I occasionally, grapple with. There were a lot of reasons not to prosecute somebody for witchcraft. There was a lot of skepticism, not necessarily about the concept of witchcraft, but there was a lot of skepticism at law about the evidence. And so that in England as a whole, the acquittal rate is over 70%, over 75%, which again goes against our stereotypes and our myths of witchcraft, where there's this feeling of as soon as somebody finds themselves in court, then they were doomed. But actually, most of the time they got off, not because of any humanitarian concern for their welfare or anything, but because of doubts about the actual evidence. So I do think that in some of the cases which do become, which are successful and there are convictions, it's sometimes because the person accused confesses. That's always the gold standard of evidence, or it's just a kind of groundswell of emotion in the places where these people live, where the witness testimony is so impassioned and there's so much of it. People seem so genuinely afraid and fearful of the people that they believe to be witches that it actually makes a deep impression upon a jury who start to think, well, could so many people really think this about this individual and this not be true? In modern terms, this is hearsay. This would be thrown out, I was sure that Claire would tell us, would be thrown out of court immediately. But actually, hearsay in the 17th century could have a certain kind of emotional power on behalf of the community that was actually quite hard to resist at law.
So many legal questions, but I'll try to restrict them because this is the Witches of Scotland and not the law questions I want to ask of Scotland. Firstly, you mentioned trial by jury, and that's fascinating because in England, trial by jury, you can get that for even minor offences, whereas in Scotland, it's always been a sheriff or a judge sitting by themselves for minor offences. So it never even crossed my mind that witch trials would be jury trials.
Yeah, they are. So the witchcraft is a felony. And witchcraft, there's the 1563 and 1604 Witchcraft Acts, and it really follows common law principles like any other trial. So, when you look at a jail calendar in the National Archives for, assizes 35, assizes 45, whatever, then you just get the whole list of all the crimes and they are tried, and you will get arson, you will get, sodomy, you'll get murder, and then you get a couple of witchcraft trials and then on to the next thing. So there's nothing special about witch trials in the order of business at an assize court. So that if somebody makes a complaint to a magistrate, then the magistrate is duty bound to, because in any felony case, to have the person detained, to get the evidence together, testimony, and then that's forwarded to the assizes. The person is then held on remand in jail until the next visitation of the judges from Westminster, who come ride out literally twice a year on their circuits, the circuit judges, and then they deliver the jail. And then all those criminals who've been there, all those accused, witches, everything, are then all tried in a session. So again, they don't decide to have a witch trial. They just do this in this very kind of procedural sort of way.
And a 70% acquittal rate, does that even include where there were confessions?
The truth about confessions is there aren't very many confessions. Yeah, it does. Yeah. But there aren't very many because, of course, torture isn't part of the formal process. Yeah. And so
well, it wasn't in Scotland either, but we still had to define torture differently and still get a lot of confessions.
That is quite true. Of course, the most effective kind of torture, as you know, is sleep deprivation, intimidation, all that stuff goes on. I mean, I'm not making any kind of defense of English magistrates, but there are cases where English magistrates are so keen to know whether the confession is genuine or not, that they will actually ask whether the person has slept or not, or whether they're saying it in a dream. Because the thing is about these English cases typically is that nobody wants to hang somebody who is innocent because, again, not because they're nice humanitarian people. They live in a totally different moral universe to us. But it's because they believe that if you execute an innocent person, their blood cries out to heaven for vengeance, and that God's providential judgment will be upon them. That's why juries are actually quite scared of convicting, because they feel because of what the providential consequences upon them might be. So they will ask a judge, they'll say to a judge, please direct us. And the judge will say, oh, well, search your hearts and God will direct you. And they think, well, that's not much good, but they're not really sure.
That's really interesting, because I hadn't really thought about the kind of the moral weight on those making the decision, because I think that and this is probably just the stereotype sort of rumbling on, that when people made the accusation and then it was investigated and whatever, that they were convinced that the person was guilty and nothing would sort of sway them. I didn't really think about the fact they might actually consider, well, could this person actually be innocent? I thought that the sort of the juggernaut of it would just keep going, and they'd be like, well, that's it, and you've got to crack eggs to make an omelette sort of approach to execution.
The doubts tend to creep in right at the start. Like you say, one of the stereotypes is that the whole community is united against the individual. Whereas there are very many English cases where, when the evidence survives for it, but they are deeply suggestive, that they tend to divide communities, and that a lot of people think the person is innocent, a lot of people think it's guilty. And it's just, when it reaches that tipping point, that it will even go forward to trial. Even those that make it to trial are are quite an exceptional sample. And out of those, you're talking about 22 to 25% success rate. One of those questions that's always puzzled me on the back of that is, why did anybody do it? They must have been aware that they had low chances of success at law. Why do people do it? And I think that it's actually, a lot of the time, it's because they are either exceptionally angry and afraid, and it's just an emotional override on the logic of whether you should. They're not even thinking whether they should or they shouldn't. They just feel they've got to. Or if there's someone else like a witch finder who gives them the courage to do so, gives them that confidence that actually that will be by their side, which is what Matthew Hopkins does during the English witch hunt of 1645 to 7. He's a sort of an enabler, a facilitator, who just sort of offers to kind of hold their hand metaphorically, so that they will feel that they can, that they have a chance. But even in the Hopkins trials, right at the start, there are 9 reprieves in the very first trial. Why? Because there are magistrates and ministers present who are not sure about the evidence.
And speaking of Hopkins, was he, I'm not sure how to phrase this, was he a witch finder for the right reasons? Did he really genuinely believe in it, or was he just realizing this was a good way to make a name for himself and get status and power? The
truth is, we don't know. The assumption always was that he did it for money, or did it for the wrong reasons, by your terms. When I wrote my book about the East Anglian witch hunt, Witch Finders, 2005, I just wanted to open up the possibility that he was sincere. And it was slightly controversial to some extent. But again, I wasn't saying I definitely could say that was the case. I was saying that there was a possibility. And of course, there were a great many men who were rather like him at the time. They didn't necessarily hunt witches, But the men who signed the king's death warrant did something at least as extraordinary as rounding up witches. And they did it out of a kind of passion and zeal and the belief that these were the last days of man and that they needed to deliver England into a different kind of future and so on. There was sincerity into their actions, even though to us now they seem like appalling, tyrannical people who were zealots, who were so sure of themselves in the name of God that they'd commit any amount of violence. You think about Cromwell in Drogheda and Wexford. Well, he felt he was God's instrument, but of course now we would think about this as genocidal massacres. And so I think that there's something of Hopkins. He was the son of a Puritan clergyman. I think he felt, like many Puritans in the Stour Valley in the 1640s, that he had a certain kind of mission. And that certainly would be consistent with the context in which he lived, rather than just kind of Vincent Price with a floppy hat on in Witchfinder General in 1968, which makes him into a monster. So it could be a bit of both. I mean, of course, there were people at the time that accused Hopkins of just doing it for the money. This wasn't a totally modern idea. But then by that stage, Hopkins had come to represent something even worse than rounding up witches for money in their eyes. It was fomenting disorder. And after the Civil War, anybody who seemed to be taking the law into their own hands was to be reviled.
Whatever he was certainly a good publicist, it would appear, if the terminology of Witchfinder General was self-imposed.
Yes, but again, like many men at this time, like Gerald Winstanley in the Diggers, they understood that you went to London and you had your pamphlet printed and you can get people to read. I mean, again, as for self-publicity, he was very much a man of his age. During the 1640s, there are over 20,000 separate titles published in London. I mean, it's just a massive outpouring on every subject under the sun. Everybody who had an idea for a book, self-publishing starts then. That's really...
We've talked about that recently, about how the sharing of confessions in little pamphlets really seemed to kind of drive things on, and it was Definitely. They were like just exciting little tabloid stories, essentially, in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. You would have petty chapmen who were just like hawkers, tinkers, who would pick these pamphlets up from St. Paul's Churchyard in London, and then they would hit the road. And so there were probably limits to how far they could take these things, but some of them make it over the Atlantic. They go over in ships. 8 weeks later, someone could be reading about this stuff in Boston. And it gets passed about, and it gets passed about by word of mouth. In the 17th century, if anybody new arrived anywhere, people clamored and said, "Oh, hello, what news? What news?" And so a lot of this stuff might get read about, and then it gets passed on so that the effect of a printed pamphlet is not just the people who could read it, it's the people who listen to the person who can read it. And that when witchcraft's concerned, I think it creates, first of all, a sense that witches are out there. Secondly, it creates a standardized image of who witches are and what they do. And thirdly, it increases confidence that you can do something about it, because these pamphlets are typically about the trials of which witches are convicted, not the trials where they are acquitted.
Now, talking about Witchfinders, you've recently been, now I'm not sure what exactly your official title was, historical consultant, something along those lines?
Yeah, I think so.
For the TV programme Witchfinder on BBC, which is still available on iPlayer. I'll admit, when Claire and I first heard about it coming out and that it was being launched on International Women's Day, we both kind of went, "Oh God, what is this?"
I think that was a pretty insensitive thing to do.
Yeah.
Have you watched it all now?
Yeah. I've really enjoyed it. And I actually found it quite moving. The last episode I thought was really kind of beautiful, actually. I really enjoyed it. And I think that Daisy May Cooper's witch, her accused witch, was fantastic. I really enjoyed her. She's great to watch.
She is. And I thought Rhys Shearsmith's Matthew Hopkins was brilliant, because I think he really, I know Rhys a bit, and I've met him a couple of times, and we talked about Hopkins before, and he was amazed that he got cast for it. And I think he just really captured something of this self-righteous sort of busybody. I think he is, not to spoil the TV series for anyone who hasn't seen it, but of course he is in it absolutely for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
I think that the way that departure from that the main character Gideon has from Hopkins's line, tells us something really actually quite important about the history. which is that not everybody agreed. And some people, and there was really the capacity for sympathy. So having said that these people lived in a totally different moral universe and that there was no humanitarian reason, they didn't acquit witches for humanitarian reasons, but there were many voices who said that the people who confess to witchcraft are old and they are frightened, and we'd be much better treating them with medicine and food and kindness. And then we might find that the so-called witchcraft that they're accused of goes away. And that becomes a very compelling argument right into the early 18th century, right into the period of the end of trials and the repeal.
It's so nice to hear that degree of nuance about it, because for so much of what we understood of witchcraft trials in Scotland, we kind of think of everyone as an amorphous group who all absolutely believed in witches, who all believed if people confessed they were witches and they had to die. It's much nicer and much more comforting in a way to think in a more nuanced sense that people were as worried about it as you say they were.
They are worried. They're not necessarily worried to the same way that we might be worried about things, but they're unsure. And that witchcraft in many people's minds is something which they absolutely agree on in theory, but in practice, they don't know. And those who are very sure of themselves in practice are either lying or, as I've said, that they are exceptionally afraid. And I think that's something which does get overlooked. I think the key to understanding people who really believe in an individual's guilt are those who are really very, very afraid of them. And that's at village level. I think the idea that there's somebody who lives over the way that you've got it into your head is trying to kill your children, then I think we can connect with those kinds of emotions, those of us with kids, those of us who are totally reasonable and law-abiding and decent and love our neighbour, feels faintly murderous, don't we, if somebody was threatening somebody that we loved.
It's such an interesting concept, and I think what's really interesting to explore is when you see people on that straight and narrow way, and as you say, family people who take one step away from that world and find themselves in a very different world. They're the same person, but they've got very, very different motives, is great to explore. And you've written not only books about witchcraft, but you've also recently written a new book which is up for an award, and that explores the idea of witchcraft a bit. Can you tell us a bit about your new book?
So I'd written this book, Witchfinders, which was about the witch hunt in East Anglia in the 1640s. And then I wrote a book called Between Two Worlds, which was about English American migrations to colonial America across the whole of the 17th century. And so that really it was kind of logical to do something which blended the two. And that everybody knows about Salem. That's obviously the Salem witch hunts of 1692, one of the most famous episodes in all of witch hunting. But in the Connecticut Valley, in a place called Springfield, 40 years earlier, there was another smaller witch hunt that showed some of the characteristics that were to be seen later on. Witch hunting is not a big thing in New England. There aren't very many trials for the first 20 years or so. There are no witch trials at all. So that to see this little outburst of witch hunting in this rather strange remote place, which is a very intense, hardworking, I suppose we would say sort of pre-capitalist or early capitalist community, where people aren't just there because they're a little godly transplanted community from England, but are really there to make money and to work. It's very interesting to see that witchcraft, the way that witchcraft there grows out of their hatred for each other, I think, which is a lot of the time is because they're very jealous of each other over land and success. That doesn't mean to say they get rid of people because they think they're witches, but I think actually there's a lot of self-loathing in these people, which is then projected onto a married couple called Hugh and Mary Parsons, and they're at the centre of the story.
I have read the book, so you've read it too.
Yes, yeah. I love it. I think it's really fascinating. For me, what's really fascinating is that our idea, I'm not going to speak for Claire. My idea about the witch hunts was absolutely from like this kind of American lens. So it's really interesting to think actually that things weren't as big there, and they weren't the way that we have this concept. Now, I'm an English teacher by training, so I've taught the Crucible. So that was absolutely what my understanding was. It was like that. So it's really fascinating. I know that on Twitter, you've got lots of people that absolutely love that book. What has the reception been like from Americans to sort of learn about that side of their history?
Well, it's not published in the States till later this year.
Right, okay.
So we might yet find out. But, you know, so the early signs, I mean, you know, some people have read it. I think that similarly, I think there are people who just had heard about Salem and thought that was it. As I say, the history of witch hunting in colonial America is very restricted indeed. And there really aren't that many cases. So, we'll wait and see. But I think, as you say, that I wrote it primarily because I'm a historian of England, and I'd really written about colonial America in my last book because I wanted to see it from the English direction, not as some kind of, English colonialism or sort of, recovering this story. But I think that the mentality was with a lot of the American historiography was the idea that when you left old England or Scotland or anywhere in the British Isles and you went to America, you were sort of glad to be there. You never went back and you sort of magically became an American, whatever that is. So actually to see these people in Springfield, Massachusetts in the 1640s, 1650s, who's still really preserving their English, and actually in Springfield, a lot of Welsh too, identity is very interesting. They take with them their beliefs, their way of life, their way of building houses, their way of eating and so on, all these things, all their culture. The other thing that they really take with them is the fact that they are, I think, not very nice. that they really don't like their neighbours very much, and they hold each other to very, very high moral standards. And so the Hugh and Mary Parsons fall foul of this. So they get all this kind of negative feeling, a lot of it, which is sort of self-loathing, which is projected outwards onto this rather unfortunate couple, who, and I think she is suffering from mental illness, and I think he is just horrible. And so they make it kind of quite easy to become the center of the fear and loathing of the community.
When you were researching it, are their descendants still living?
Goodness, well, we'll probably, I mean, certainly with Salem, that, there are, I mean, I've had many emails from people who say, I am the great granddaughter. Well, of course, when you get that far back, there are lots of people who are, family trees go sideways as well as long ways, because it becomes huge. So, you and I are probably related to them at somewhere along the line. But they're very obscure people, you see, unlike a lot of the Salem characters where their names were, names are actually quite well known, and they were even quite well known even before the Crucible. There's a memorial to them, and there have been lots, and there have been films and so on. These people are quite well known now, but Springfield, no. I mean, they're these, who's heard of Hugh and Mary Parsons? They're totally obscure characters, really. No memorial.
They have now.
Yeah, they have now. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Another book that you've written that I'd really like to talk to you about is about Helen Duncan, who is somebody that sometimes it kind of people cross their wires when they're talking about our campaign, and they say, well, what about Helen Duncan?
The witch.
He was the last witch and so on. And, obviously that isn't really what happened in her story. No. Can you tell us a wee bit about that?
Her nickname as a child, she came from Callander and was born at the end of the 19th century. And her nickname as a child was Hellish Nell. That's how she was known. And I heard that from a guy who ran a bed and breakfast I stayed in Callander on around about New Year's Day. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm researching. He said, oh, Hellish Nell. And from that point, I found out that there was a local memory of her as this rather strange child. But she grew into a spiritualist medium. By the 1930s, she was doing the kind of Rolls Royce of spiritualist mediumship, which was materialization. So she purported at seances to produce ectoplasm, this strange swirling white plastic substance from her body, that she would clothe the spirits of the dead so you could go along to these seances and be reunited with your loved ones. Well, some people believed in that. Some people still believe in it. Some people thought it was nonsense. She was exposed in fraud several times. Some people said, oh, well, she was a genuine medium and she was pushed into that by the pressure of her followers and her clients. Well, you never win these kinds of arguments with spiritualists about whether she was genuine or not. She certainly was exposed in fraud. And that really reached a head during the Second World War, because she was talking about shipping, because of obviously worried and bereaved women were going to her asking about sons and husbands and brothers. And she was watched by the authorities. Then in 1944, a seance was broken up in Portsmouth, and she was tried at the Old Bailey under the Witchcraft Act. And that's where we get to the nub of the witch. So they used the Witchcraft Act because it carried because this is from 1735. So when the English and the Scottish Witchcraft Acts were repealed in 1735-36. They were replaced with another act called the Witchcraft Act, confusingly, but that made it a crime to pretend to the act of conjuration. So basically it was for fraud, but they used it in 1944, although it seemed antiquated, because they could actually meant they could put her in prison, and they wanted to, because it was just before D-Day, and they wanted her to shut up and keep her out of circulation. So the judge at the trial, that all the journalists from Fleet Street came in there, and he said, "Can I just remind gentlemen of the press that this is not a witch trial?" Right. So, of course, all the journalists wrote down witch trial. Witch trial. Of course they did. And the fact they used the witchcraft, I think that they were really asking for it. And the trial was very interesting. The trial goes on for a week or so. And there was a spiritualist defence barrister, Charles Loseby. And Loseby, what he decided to do was to try and prove that Helen Duncan was a real, genuine medium by getting lots and lots and lots of witnesses. But of course, the crime was pretending to do this, was actually trying to do it. So all the defense witnesses, all they were doing was working for the prosecution by actually proving that she tried to do it. And Loseby just didn't get it. And
can I just check? He was a spiritualist, you said. So he himself was a believer.
Absolutely. And that's why he was hired. He'd been in the First World War and had very traumatic experience at Passchendaele. And he came as a very committed spiritualist. So, what that meant was he missed the point of really what he was being prosecuted, which seems extraordinary. But the prosecuting barrister for the Crown, he was actually an MI5 officer. So, that really it was, I think it was obviously going to go the Crown's way. I mean, Loseby said, oh, look, Mrs. Duncan will perform a seance in court to prove she's genuine. And of course, this very dry judge said, oh, no, that won't be necessary. I'm not having my court turned into a circus and so on. But the thing is that by 1944, going back to talking about, the importance of print and pamphlets when we were talking about the 17th century, that by 1944, people are very, very tired of the war and they've become very sort of inured to the headlines. And so actually to have this witch trial, in inverted commas, happening created a lot of excitement. So it really was, for a short period of time, quite a cause célèbre. And Churchill heard about it. Churchill issued a memo and said, why are we doing this? Why are we wasting resources? We're just before D-Day. And never really got an answer. But actually, the police were very concerned that she was lowering morale by telling lies about people's loved ones.
What I was wondering was, why did the authorities bother? Because in one view, you've got a woman performing what many people would think is a circus act or, something of the like. There were lots of people that were disbelievers, as well as lots of people who were believers. But there was enough people who disbelieved for her not to be doing, I suppose, broad harm in the community. So I had understood that, in fact, she had told a specific person that their loved one was dead, and that shouldn't have been known by her. And is that right?
She did. She told a woman that her husband, as I recall, was on HMS Bar. He was on HMS Barham, and the Barham had been sunk. But actually, it was very well known in Portsmouth, because half the women in Portsmouth had a husband on that ship. And the Admiralty wrote to them and said, "Your husband is dead, but please don't tell anyone."
Oh, now, for all this time, I had harboured just a little secret, because I don't believe in ghosts or devils, but I am wildly superstitious, and if left alone in an empty house, would start seeing ghosts, that kind of way. I don't believe in them, but that part of your brain. So I had always harboured just a little kind of fantasy, I suppose, that although she'd done all these vaudeville things, although she'd produced ectoplasm that wasn't real and she'd been found out and all those things, the true story was that she had actually told somebody that their loved one had died and she couldn't have known it, but she could have. It's not special knowledge.
You see, what people really wanted from her seances was not sort of information. They wanted to be reunited. And so that this man who died on the ship supposedly appeared. And that was the thing. So it wasn't that the authorities were concerned. It wasn't like, how did she know this? She must be a German spy. It was that she's talking about shipping again, because in earlier in 1941, she talked about HMS Hood as well. And so she seemed to have a bit of previous. Now, in wartime, you see, part of the spiritualist storytelling about this was always that she was considered to be extremely dangerous, and therefore they had to do something about it. And, you know, the injustice lay in the fact that they got all the powers of the state against her. Well, most local police stations had an MI5 officer attached to them during the war. It was really very normal to report on anyone who seemed to be saying or doing anything. And especially towards D-Day, when there was such incredible sensitivity about trying to preserve the secret of landing in Normandy and not landing in the Pas-de-Calais, so that really anyone doing anything was liable to have something. And the fact that there was a woman who seemed to routinely go around the country talking about shipping was really enough for them to do something about it. Now, the authorities would have been very happy to have basically prosecuted her in Portsmouth Magistrates Court and had done with it and fined her. But actually what then happened was the Spiritualist National Union said, no, we are going to empty our war chest. We're going to get a barrister and let's have an Old Bailey trial. And of course the Crown said, okay, let's have it at the Old Bailey. We can put up a KC against yours, against your barrister. So let's do it. So that really the Spiritualist National Union, I think, actually rather, escalated that rather than the British state coming down and this whole idea of a sledgehammer to crack a nut,
Was she sentenced for long?
So she's sentenced for 9 months in Holloway and she served 6 of them.
It seems to me a bit of a shame to tell people not to talk about ships and stuff like that and not to talk about them, but then to have told people themselves, their family members, to say...
Heard. They were grief-stricken. If your husband had been killed, you didn't then go out with a brave face and not tell anybody. Of course, these people were devastated. And I don't know how many went down in the Barham, but I mean, we're talking about 900, 1,000 men, I think. Something like this is a catastrophic emotional wound upon these working class communities of Portsmouth, who were already very tight knit, as it were. I mean, it's a totally absurd and cruel and insensitive thing to do. But there were so few battleships, you see, at that time that the Admiralty thought that perhaps if they could keep this a secret a bit longer, it might confuse the Germans or something. But how Helen Duncan knew the Barham had been sunk, I think, doesn't really bear too much, and it's fairly obvious. What was always very interesting to me was just, again, I am sort of at some level a historian of emotions, and I think even that story was just really showed that belief, it isn't some absolute intellectual thing. It follows your emotional need. And so that the people saw incredible things. I met people who saw incredible things at Helen Duncan seances. I don't think that those things were there, but these are perfectly rational, decent people who saw them. And they saw them because they were emotionally predisposed to see bits of cheesecloth on coat hangers and so on as their loved ones. And that's a really extraordinary story.
Yeah, absolutely. Did Helen Duncan have a sidekick at some point? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. I got into a taxi with a taxi driver once, a very knowledgeable man and a retired man, who said that his great aunt had been a sidekick to Helen Duncan when she lived in Scotland and helped her with her meetings and seances, and then went on to have a sort of low-level career herself after Helen moved south. The gentleman that was telling me as truth, but I just wonder whether or not the great aunt had told him the truth.
She always did have a sidekick, because she needed somebody who, and I think certainly when she was working in Portsmouth and the southeast, she needed someone who basically found little bits of information, who booked she used to put ads in the local papers saying, she'll be appearing. She didn't like traveling that much. Her life was a bit chaotic. She needed a kind of PA type person so she always did have some kind of helper. My book that I wrote about, it was never about, let's expose Helen Duncan as a fraud and somehow laugh at her. I just really wanted to recreate the world in which she lived and where the things that she did were for some people possible, which is a bit like the stuff I've written about witchcraft since, nuanced on a knife edge of possibility, But Helen Duncan did always depend on someone. Her health was very poor. I think certainly some part of her life she may have been dependent on alcohol, certainly later on, because she carries on after the war. And there are reports from spiritualists who say we went and we could smell whiskey on her breath and so on, and she seemed chaotic. And so I think she was a very troubled person. I think she was very troubled from a very early age, and I have a lot of sympathy for her as a character.
And there's a possibility that our listeners might see her on the big screen sometime.
Well, we hope so. It's been a long time coming, but the rights of Hellish Nell have gone off to a production company, and there is a script. I've worked with an American screenwriter in the last couple of years, and he produced a fantastic script, which is a real insight into Helen Duncan's life, and particularly her marriage, and the sort of triangle between her husband, and her spirit guide, Albert, who is a sort of projection of her ideal husband, I think. And poor old Henry Duncan has to put up with living with the three of them in this strange earth to spirit relationship. But that's hopefully what there's going to be the spine of the story. So watch this space. We hope that in the next couple of years it may yet see the light of day.
Great. I really hope that does come up, because I think that sounds like such a brilliant story. It's so interesting because she can't, like, from what I remember from reading about it, she had to support the family, didn't she? That her husband was injured in the war, and they had several children, and that was just a way of making money.
Yeah, he was invalided out of the war. He did have a cabinet making business, but he didn't make much money. And yes, they had a family, and this was their means of income. And again, I'd say it's like Matthew Hopkins. It's not really like Matthew Hopkins at all, but I think she certainly did make money, but she didn't make as much money as people think that she made.
Yeah.
And she certainly didn't become hugely rich out of it. And I think, to some extent it was, the whole story is about gender, and it's about religion, but it's also about class. And so that when she was in the early 1930s, when she was taken to London to be tested by spiritualist organizations, when she went to the London Spiritualist Alliance to be tested, these were kind of very well-heeled, educated men and women of London society who would go to her seances, but she didn't go in through the main entrance. She went through the tradesman's entrance at the back. So that in those situations, still those very rigid class distinctions of the day were preserved. But these middle-class spiritualists had a reverence for the working class medium, because they felt that in this incredibly patronizing way that they were innocents and that they were uncorrupted and that they couldn't possibly have some malicious or devious motive.
They were too pure, the working classes were too pure to have the connivance. Is that the idea? Yeah,
I think that's certainly the idea. And I think also because she perhaps, I don't know whether she was certainly uneducated. I think she was a, simple soul in many ways. And I think that these gentlemen thought this was terribly interesting to have because she was just a conduit in their minds for the spirits. And because perhaps her head wasn't cluttered up with education or breeding, that somehow she would be a purer instrument for broadcasting the voices from beyond the veil.
Like a sort of empty vessel, allowing to be filled with the most sound.
Absolutely.
I wonder if those spiritualists believed that there was a class system in the spirit world.
That's a very interesting question. I interviewed a lot of spiritualists. And in fact, I did go to a medium with a man who'd known Helen Duncan very well. And he was, again, very educated, middle-class chap in Purley in Surrey. And he took me to his medium, who was a very ordinary working-class medium. And she did put me in touch with Helen Duncan, supposedly. Helen Duncan did come through in spirit. And she put on a bit of a silly Scottish accent for a bit, and I wasn't terribly convinced. But he thought we saw the same thing, me and the chap that took me. He thought this was incredible. And I thought it was just a story, But I started asking him, really, what's the spirit world like? And he said, oh, well, I'm amazed Mrs. Duncan came through to you because it's so incredibly busy up there. And I said, well, yeah, but what's it like? He said, well, it's just like down here. And of course, when you start pushing at what the spirit world like, the only way that the spiritualists that I met had to describe it was that it was just a nicer version of here. But people you end up saying things like, do people have to do the laundry and, go to Sainsbury's? And of course, well, yes, they do. And it's like, and this is why George Bernard Shaw, once said that, I really hope that I hope there's no life after death, because an eternity of doing the same stuff as you did on Earth with the same people would be absolutely unbearable. Please let death be an end to it, So imagining the spirit world is a really, really tricky thing, I think.
Can I ask what your next book might be about if you're working on another book?
Okay, so it's been 30 years on witches, and now I'm writing a book not about witches. I don't know whether this is a heretical thing to say on the Witches of Scotland podcast.
No, it's fine.
It's actually, I'll tell you very quickly, it's actually about prisoners of war in Italy in 1943 to 5. So my great uncle Ralph left an incredible memoir about escaping from prisoner of war camps and going on the run and becoming a partisan. And I'm just sort of researching that story, but also how we write about stories like that too. So it's a little bit about, how a historian like me would start thinking of those things. And I suppose really that although that might seem like a total shift away from anything I've done before, anybody who's read the epilogue to The Ruin of All Witches, it's a bit like that. It's about really the kind of, sort of imaginative relationship that a historian has with the subject matter, and how much of that you put into it and how much of it becomes a kind of flight of fancy and so on. So that, it's really me as a historian trying to be honest, I suppose, about what we put into our stories and about how historians need to use imagination to bring the information from dry documents and so on to life.
That sounds great. I'll very much look forward to that one. So you're just in the midst of writing that just now, or researching it first?
Just at the beginning of it now, just doing lots of research into, it does kind of remind me of doing Hellish Nell in a way, because I'm, really trying to put together people's childhoods. And so my uncle Ralph, he escapes with an amazing guy called Charlie West. Anybody listening to this, you can tell me anything about Charlie West of Plymouth, please get in touch. But I have actually managed to find the family now. But it's just building up a story of someone's rather difficult childhood, I think, and trying to get a sense of the sort of person they become later on. Because as historians, we're always trying to understand who these people are, and we nearly always get them wrong at the start. But the more you start putting together their lives from their earliest age, they make more and more sense, I think. And that's really what I'm trying to do.
I love the idea of telling stories of the history of ordinary people doing extraordinary things or living in extraordinary times, because we hear about kings, we hear about queens, we hear about Churchill, we hear about people making big decisions on wars. But in fact, much more interesting history is, what were those people doing then? What did they think? How did they interact with the world? How did they do their laundry? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, again, it's not that long ago, even going back to the 1650s, we're only talking about 15, 16 generations ago, something like that. And so when we're into even into the early 20th century, it's just about passing out of living memory, I think. But we grew up with people we knew who were Victorians. I think that's an amazing link that we have to people who lived in a really totally different age and thought very differently. But you're quite right. So that in Hellish Nell, for example, it's not a book about Churchill. Churchill has a walk-on part and then he walks off again. But Helen Duncan's there in centre stage all the time. And she's a very ordinary person who becomes very extraordinary for a short period and then fades back into obscurity. And they're the kind of stories I like.
I never thought of Hellish Nell's story or her prosecution actually as being a witch hunt, but I'm now starting to think that the last person accused of witchcraft, it was a witch hunt in a way, because they were pursuing her for something.
Well, the interesting thing, that there's there were lots of letters written to the Home Office, not all from spiritualists, from people who heard about Helen Duncan's prosecution and thought it was a witch hunt, and wrote, so that all these letters are all preserved in the Home Office archives, in the National Archives in London. And the letters say things like, didn't we just fight a war against the Nazis who were persecuting people? Why are we persecuting this woman? And actually, the Witchcraft Act is repealed quite soon afterwards, in 1950. And it's almost certainly with this kind of wind of complaint in their sails. And that the Act is then, in 1951, the Witchcraft Act is replaced with the Fraudulent Mediums Act. That means that spiritualists will no longer be persecuted for their religion, because it was and remains their religion, and they're absolutely entitled to practice that. But of course, the Witchcraft Act and also the Vagrancy Act of 1824 that made it illegal to tell fortunes meant that, in effect, all spiritualists up to that point were potentially persecuted. So, yeah, I think it was. But whether it was a witch hunt or not against Helen Duncan, a lot of people who had been through the war and had seen Nazism defeated felt like it was a kind of persecution that the victorious Britain should distance itself from.
Such an interesting perspective. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
It's been brilliant talking to you, and there's lots of reading to do there and to sort of go on with for listeners too. We will keep our eyes peeled for the film adaptation of Hellish Nell. That'll be very interesting, and also, of course, for your next book whenever it does come out. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for giving up your time to talk to us.
The pleasure's been mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this week's episode. That's 59 episodes. I actually can't really believe that, Claire. I know I always make a joke of this, but that does seem ridiculous. 59 episodes.
It does. And we've still got so many people to speak. We've got Melissa Fox, who's coming to speak to us. We hope to be speaking to her soon. We have the senator in the US who was involved with the school children, who got the last woman, Elizabeth Johnston, pardoned in Salem.
Mm-hmm.
We've got more academics
stop giving it away. You need to give like a certain amount of like, ooh, what's next?
Right. Mystique.
It's a mystique on your segue podcast there.
I have just
maybe we should record an episode on segues.
No, I don't. I think that definitely wouldn't work. And I have now just looked up a segue and now realised what you mean with two wheels at the side. What the hell I thought I was thinking of, I don't know.
A bicycle.
That's possible. In fairness to me, I think it was more like a scooter, but I don't know why I thought it had one wheel.
Yeah, no.
Anyway, this is definitely not the content people join us for. Can I say one? We like contact people on Twitter, and we have Instagram, and we have Facebook. Should be time to make TikTok number 3.
I mean, okay, but I'm not doing a dance.
You don't have to do that. There are lots of people not doing dances.
Well, the content that I've seen on the few TikToks that I've watched have been dances, hilarious parenting stories, wigs, makeup things, and hauls from Primark. Like, all of those things are hugely interesting on their own, but I don't know that I want to make necessarily a short film about any of them.
Zoe, are you telling me that you haven't seen Raccoon Talk on TikTok?
Shut the front door.
Zoe.
There's not a Raccoon Talk TikTok.
Of course, millions of people watching raccoons every day. Well-trained raccoons, not like your imaginary ones, Zoe.
I don't like the implication. How dare you? They're not made up. I'm not a fantasist.
Can I just tell you it's not an implication when you directly accuse somebody of it?
Well, okay, legal expert. I think it is slander. You're slandering me that I am not some sort of raccoon impresario trainer circus lady. That's outrageous.
Have you ever heard of the phrase Veritas, Zoe?
I take quite a flexible approach to Veritas.
I see.
Flexible Veritas is what I term it. Yes. It's funny because that's what one of my raccoons is called.
Yeah.
I've got Veritas, I've got Fabulous.
And Darcy.
Darcy. We don't talk about Darcy. He's naughty. Anyway, let's move on. Do get in touch with us on Instagram, on Twitter. That's the best place to go for a chat. Facebook is mostly info. We don't really comment or chat too much on there. Obviously, keep your eyes peeled for new TikTok content. I'm frowning and shaking my head into the camera. And anywhere else, Claire?
I think that's all.
Unless
you want to open up a LinkedIn page.
No, because isn't that for people being professional?
Well, we're professionals.
Yeah, okay.
Professional podcasters, Zoe.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, again, Veritas rears its beautiful head.
Yes,
Depends
what
on
do you
your
think?
definition of professional.
Yeah. Okay, we'll just
To me,
leave that.
professional indicates 1, you're getting paid, and 2, that you're really good at it and serious.
Okay. Well, given the last sort of hour or so, I think we should just maybe stick with the socials we're on.
Yes, that's very sensible. Okay, so over and out, toodle pip.
Bye.
Bye.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.